Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we are once again looking at the suggestions passed to developers, and we're back having a look at the Yugoslavian aviation tech tree. This time, instead of having a look at the other section, we're having a look at the Ikarus section and also the Zmaj section. And the way I would describe these is, I suppose, a lot of prototypes, a lot of experimental vehicle, a lot of research aircraft, and a lot of weird and wonderful things, and also stuff which just didn't exist. So let's get started. The first one is the Hawker Fury Series 1A and also the Ikarus Fury. So you may be used to the Fury that we have in the game, but this is slightly different from it. The Hawker Fury Series 1A that the Yugoslavs used was a slightly different one to the Mark I Britain had. It had a more powerful engine in it, and the Ikarus Fury as well, and also the Zmaj Fury had even more powerful engines. The construction design was also slightly different, and they could also be equipped with additional guns. They could have 4 machine guns in total on the machines, so giving them more firepower and also better engine performance. Moving on, we have the Ikarus IK1 and also the IK1L. These are interesting, I suppose, monoplanes when it comes to it. And what's interesting about these ones is they were built in the 1930s. There was 12 of them overall built, but not IK1s and IK1Ls. IK1s, IK1Ls, IK2s, basically this whole series of sets of planes. They were high-wing, single-seat monoplane fighter aircraft, and they were actually designed by French-trained engineers Kosta Sivchev and also Lubomir Viliak, which is probably why they're very similar to some of the vehicles that we already have in game. The IK1 is very much an interesting one. It is powered by a 12-cylinder Hispano-Suiza 12 YCRS engine with a Hispano-Suiza HS404 20mm autocannon mounted between the cylinder banks of the engine and firing through the propeller hub. It was able to have around about 860 horsepower on it, and also combined with the hub-firing cannon mandated the use of a metal fuselage. It could also carry, if it wanted, 2 synchronized French-made 7.9mm Dame machine guns, which were mounted under and to each side of the engine. What is also interesting about this thing is permission was actually granted for flight testing to begin in April 1935, and Bajdak conducted his first flight in the prototype, which would be the IK1L, which is talked about here, on the 22nd of April 1935. For this initial uneventful flight, no weapons were installed and a light fuel load was used. The following day, they put the IK-1 into unplanned aerobatic maneuvers, and after which the wing fabric was observed as being slack, and an official from Ikarus checked it and stated that this would resolve once the fabric varnished had completely dried on it. And then Bajtak took the aircraft for a third test flight the next day, which involved more unplanned aerobatics. I like the excuses given in this article. And when the aircraft was at 1,000 meters, Bajdak put it into a shallow dive and pulled up abruptly at high speed, and at which point the wing fabric began to tear rapidly, to the extent that it could be seen from the ground. So the aircraft dropped into a spin to starboard, and Bajdak bailed out safely, while the IK-1 crashed into the ground. So unfortunately, the prototype didn't have a great time, but at least it was flight worthy a little bit and did have an interesting set of engines and, well, engine and also a pretty cool armament as well. So yeah, a pretty interesting machine. The general difference between them is the IK-1L, which was the first prototype. It had one 20mm Orkan cannon and 2 Darn machine guns, and the other IK-1 had an HS404 cannon and also a slightly different engine. Then we move on to the IK-2, which was a further continuation of the IK-1, and it changed some structural advancements, different engine, radiator setup, different landing gear, and also a higher top speed overall. They also went with a much better general look at it as well. The main difference from the IK-1 to the IK-2 was that the wings were covered with metal sheeting, leaving only the rear fuselage and tailplane fabric covered. The new wing was tested with both fabric and metal coverings at the request of the VVKJ, and other changes were a radiator of reduced size and also improved shape, modified air intakes, and also this gave it a more streamlined fuselage. The two Darn guns were replaced with two 7.92 Browning FN machine guns as well, but it also kept, I believe, the 20mm. So it would be a little bit more devastating when it came to the overall firepower, and also wouldn't fall apart. So that to me is a plus. The next one is the Ikarus MM2. Now this is our first trainer aircraft. There are a bunch of trainer aircrafts in here. If I was going to sum up this tree, it would be one-off prototypes, trainer aircraft, experimental aircraft, and then a few weird botch jobs, and then other vehicles that never existed. So the Ikarus MM2, being one of these aircraft, was a trainer one. It was a 1940 prototype single-engine low-wing monoplane. Only one of them was built, so it was a trainer prototype, and it was generally used, the idea was to make it into a trainer aircraft. And it also was powered by a pretty interesting engine, which you're probably all used to, the IAM K7. They also thought about fitting a gnome Roan in this thing, which would have definitely been interesting, but unfortunately they decided not to go forward with it, which, you know, it would have been quite nice. The armament also, it's kind of interesting how all of these things are written, because a lot of it is written like the armament should be this, or it could be this, instead of it was, and I always find that a bit odd. I don't know why that is. I don't know whether these things actually had armament, or if they didn't have armament, especially when it came to the test flights and stuff, but I'm just going with they did have the armament, and if I'm wrong, then c'est la vie. You'll just have to use them to ram other aircraft, I suppose. So this one, the MM2, had access to two Darn 77mm machine guns, which would have 2,175 rounds. What was also interesting about the vehicle is it could also have a bomb pylon attached to it on the lower fuselage, and this could carry 4 bombs. And you know how big these bombs were? 10 kilos each. That's right, we are absolutely annihilating people with these bombs. Same with the HE-51 hydroplane, which is a little bit of fun. The next one on the list is the Ikarus S-49. This is actually probably the most interesting vehicle when it comes to it, because, well, it's a whole series of vehicles from Ikarus. The S-49 was the prototype version of the vehicle, and even though you may look at this vehicle and think, oh, well, this looks pretty interesting, you know, it's probably, you know, a mid-World War II vehicle, you know, it looks very similar to other designs of the time. The Yakovlevs come to mind when I have a look at this thing, and also, you know, some of the other monoplane single-engine fighter designs, but this was a post-World War II vehicle. The first flight of this was actually 1949, and it was introduced in the 1950s, so this was a 1950s to 1960s aircraft used by the Yugoslav Air Force, and there was about 150 of them made overall. As I said, the first one was the actual prototype, which was just, you know, put together to test, and the next one we're having a look at is the S-49A. This is very much an interesting vehicle. It's the first production version of the S-49, and it was armed with one 20mm Shevak and also two M2 Brownings, which had 120 rounds in total for the Shevak and 200 rounds per gun for the Brownings, which is pretty cool. So a nice little mixed armament there. Also, another thing to mention about it is it was actually a mixed construction version aircraft. So the S-49A had a Soviet-built VK-105 engine in it, which were no longer available after 1948. Therefore, it was decided to produce a new version of the aircraft, which was powered by the similar French Hispano-Suiza 12Z-17 engine. Because of the bigger, heavier engine, the new aircraft had to be an all-metal construction with a much longer nose. And guess what? You know which vehicle that is? That's right, it's the next one on our list. It's the S-49C 2359. So this vehicle basically came around because of the fact that they just stopped producing the engine that was used in the S-49A. So elongated, was able to do high speeds, had a pretty powerful engine in it, and also had access to an MG151 instead of just having access to the Shevak. So it replaced the Shevak with the MG151. It also had a slightly different tail design as well, and was faster than its predecessor, which I think is pretty awesome. The next one to have a look at is the Ikarus Orkan, and this is another one-off prototype which was designed and supposedly built at the start of the war. It was a 3-seater twin-engine monoplane. It was designed as a light bomber / reconnaissance aircraft for the Kingdom of Yugoslavia before World War II, and the prototype was completed in April 1940. It had access to 2 Fiat A74 RC38 engines, which were 4-cylinder air-cooled radial piston engines with 829 horsepower each. It also had a ton of guns at its disposal, 3 20mm, 3 7.92 millimeters, and could carry 4 106 kilo bombs. Basically, after the prototype was completed in April 1940, the first flight was planned to be in the same month, but unfortunately, due to an additional trimming, the maiden flight was made at Zemun Airport on the 24th of June 1940. When landing, it was damaged, and due to the war in Europe, its repair took longer, and it was not able to restart testing until March 1941. Flights began on the 19th of March 1941, and 13 flights were made by the 5th of April. The aircraft showed good results to meet the expectations which were set for the project, but serial production did not start because of the invasion of Yugoslavia by the Germans and Italians on the 6th of April. So during the brief war, the Orkan was damaged and captured in September 1941, and then it was sent to Germany for testing, and unfortunately, we don't know what happened to it. So that's basically the story of it. The next one, well, actually, there is another thing as well. Technically, you could have 2 separate versions of this vehicle, even though there was literally only one prototype. Of course, there could be 2 separate versions. The first one would have the Fiat engines, which I talked about before, and then have the one HS 404 20mm and 2 7.92s, also a 50 cal for a top defensive turret, and then the version which had the Hispano-Suiza HS 14AB engines. It would have 2 20mm HS 404s, 2 7.92mm FN machine guns, and then 1 20mm MG-FF in a top defensive turret, and 1 7.92mm FN machine gun lower defensive turret. Moving on, we have the Ikarus 215. This was another prototype aircraft. This one, there was once again only one built. It was actually first flew after the war, surprisingly. This being a light bomber and training aircraft of mixed construction, and even though it didn't go into production, it did have at least some interesting stuff to it. It was based on the Zmaj R1, so there was at least a basis for it, and the aircraft was not produced. During testing, it was determined that the aircraft would not be able to respond to the primary purpose, which was to be a light twin-engine bomber. It also contributed to the unexpected rapid development of aviation. So basically, because of the fact that the jet age was upon us, especially in 1949 when this thing first flew, it was basically looked at it and been like, yeah, this thing's kind of useless. So they just dropped it. So it was mainly used as a training school bomber. So it would train pilots for bombing and also it was withdrawn from use in 1957. The vehicle itself's power plants were two Ranger SGV 770Cs. They had 519 horsepower each, and it actually had two-bladed propellers, which is kind of interesting. No unfortunate look at what bomb load this thing could carry. The next set is the experimental stuff that we talked about, starting with the Ikarus 4511 and also the 4512. So the 4511 is a very, very odd plane, and I've got to say is pretty cool, and isn't really a surprise that it is a research aircraft. So the Ikarus 451, it was the original aircraft of the tests, and this was basically to just test stuff like I'll just read it to you. The Ikarus 451 is a family of research aircraft designs built in Yugoslavia in the 50s, all sharing the same basic airframe, but differing in power plants and cockpit arrangements. So it's basically testing the airframe and going forward from there. And the 451, which we have, the first one that you can see, is interesting because it is fitted with two Walter Minor 6.3 piston engines, and also the cockpit is actually in a prone position. So basically, in order to fly this thing, the pilot would lay down to be able to fly. It's showing how small this machine is. It's absolutely tiny what this thing had. I have no idea if it had any guns. I have no idea, if it had anything like that, but it did have two 160 horsepower engines. This stinks of a third scale or 2/3 scale aircraft that would have been built during the war to test a design, and that's basically what this thing is, apart from they started after the war. So that's at least kind of interesting. The next vehicle as well, we're actually staying on the 451 and the 4512. The first version was armed with one MG131 cannon, while the second one had two. Fair enough, I can't find confirmation of that, but there you go. And then the next one is the Ikarus S451M Miasny. Now this is a weird jet, I think is the best way to put it. All of these research vehicles are weird jets, but this one kind of takes the cake just because of its odd design. This machine was derived directly from the S451 airframe, and it basically had different engines to the previous version. It had incredibly weak engines for what would be classed as a jet. Basically, this vehicle in itself had two Turbomeca Palaz engines. These gave 1.5 kilonewtons or 330 pounds of force for thrust each. So that's absolutely tiny. The maximum speed of this vehicle was 470 kilometers an hour. So if this was added into the game, it would easily be the slowest jet in the game by far. At the same time as well, it was armed with one 20mm cannon, and that 120mm cannon was a Hispano HS404A, and it would have access to 50 rounds. Then you actually get into the more interesting stuff. You have the Ikarus J45MM, the Sturgelian, and then the Ikarus T451MM Sturgelian 2, and these actually look way more like, your normal machines. These look very much more like meteors in my opinion, and the difference between the two vehicles compared to, the ones before it is these had Turbomeca Marbor engines, so they had more powerful engines, and they also had cannon armament as well, which would fit them. So basically, the first one, the J451MM Sturgeon 2, would be a main fighter variant, and it would have two Hispano Mark II cannons with 240 rounds in total, where the second one would have two seats and and would also have access to secondary ordnance options, so it would be able to carry more weight. So one of them would be kind of like a fighter bomber, maybe an attacker, and the other one would just be a fighter variant. Remember, these were research aircraft, and there was only one of them built. Well, you know, there was one of each built, I should say. So all of these are one-off, unique vehicles, and very, very interesting. The next one is the Ikarus B4. Not so unique. It's a Blenheim. It's a Blenheim Mark IV, which has been heavily modified. These were license built in Yugoslavia, and basically the improvements included a 20mm Hispano cannons, which we used, and overall a better design, and also they use the Italian Alfa Romeo engines as well. So those were the differences. I would say this is unique enough to be seen as a different vehicle. Then we go into a next one. This is the S-49B. This literally didn't exist. It is a plan to build an S-49C, but with a DB605 German engine. It was never built, so we can move on. The Ikarus IK-02 also. This was a prototype of the IK-2 with slight construction design differences, and in 1937 it was found that it completely outshone the Fury and showed it was really good, so that's great. The next one's the IK-5. Now the IK-5, right, this machine stinks of, oh, look at our wonderful wonder weapon that we've produced, but we haven't actually produced it. I see this quite a lot with with a lot of machines, and I feel the IK-5 is very similar. So pretty much what happened with the IK-5 is, at least from what I can tell from this, reading of it, is the development of the IK-3, which was around at the time, encouraged three designers to start looking into building a twin-engine fighter. It was designed to have a long-range reconnaissance, photographic reconnaissance, and also operate as a destroyer or a heavy fighter, very similar to the Zastora class, which you find from the Germans. And at the time, this was in the form of the Messerschmitt Bf-110. So these concepts included a one-seater and a two-seater version, and development of these new aircraft, designated the IK-5, would commence on the back of the success of the IK-3. So they ordered a one-seater prototype in early July 1939, with the first flight being scheduled in late 41. But, once again, Yugoslavia got invaded. So the production of the prototype was near completion, but it was not pursued either during or after the war. So the advanced Yugoslav Ikarus S-49 fighter produced after World War II was the one that they went for instead of the IK-5. And I can't find any actual images or any actual documentation on that this thing was actually built. The only images you can find are either very, very small scale models, downscaled models of this thing, or what look like wind tunnel testing models of it. Now, according to the Post, there was one prototype built with engines installed, and the top speed was 690 kilometers an hour, climb rate 16.7 meters per second. It had two Hispano cannons and also 7.92 millimeter Browning machine guns. But as I said, I can't find any data on it, and I can't find if, it was built or not. Hopefully there's an image wandering about, or hopefully there's confirmation of it, but yeah, at least for me, this one's a bit up in the air. The next one is the Ikarus 452M. Now, the Ikarus 452M is actually a really cool vehicle, and once again, it is a research aircraft, but there was two of these built, so slightly different to the other ones. Those two of them around, and these use the Turbomeca Palaz engines again, but this one is actually in a really interesting configuration. So it was a stubby mid-wing fixed-wing cantilever monoplane of pod and boom configuration. Basically, the jets were mounted vertically, one on top of each other, kind of like how we have the Lightning in-game. They were mounted like that in the rear of the fuselage nacelle, with separate intakes for the lower engine in the wing roots and the upper engine on the sides of the rear fuselage. So this thing was a really cool design. It was also armed, it had 4 12.7mm M3 Browning machine guns, and it was able to go a maximum speed of 780 kilometers an hour. This, to me, is the most unique design out of all of these. I think it looks really cool. It's a pretty interesting machine, so it would be kind of nice to see, what it's like. The article talks about how it's comparable to the Meteor Mark III in terms of performance, and also they considered a switch to 20mm Hispanos, but never went past the drawing board, and only the J451mm Surgeons 2 received the 2 cannons, so this one was stuck with the 50 cals. So moving on to Zmaj, we have 4 aircraft on offer. The first one is the Zmaj HE-8, and this is a license-built version of the Heinkel HE-8. Even though it is of German origin, it was never actually used by the Luftwaffe, and the reason for this is because the reconnaissance float plane was actually built at the request of the Danish Navy. They had seen the success of the HE-5 in Swedish service, and they wanted a version of it which was slightly better, and that's basically where the HE-8 came from. The actual power plant of this machine was the Armstrong Siddeley Jaguar. It was a 14-cylinder, 2-row air-cooled geared radial piston engine which had 430 horsepower, and also the armament it had was obviously quite weak, being of course a reconnaissance float plane, but still it was okay. It had one fixed forward-firing 8mm Madsen machine gun, one trainable rearward-firing 8mm Madsen machine gun, and if this thing ever comes to game, it would have the smallest bombs in existence. This thing could carry 12, yes that's right, 12 0.5 kilogram bombs. Yes, it could carry 12 1.1 pound bombs. They are absolutely tiny. I have no idea what you would use them for. Maybe the idea is to drop them on actually, infantry or, sailors instead of actual structures, but they are absolutely tiny. The next vehicle on offer is the Zmaj R1. This was a prototype bomber. It was armed with 2 20mm Hispanos and 2 7.92 machine guns, or it could actually carry 2 American 50 cals. Even though this thing was a prototype, it could supposedly carry 1,600 kilos worth of bombs, which would be carried internally. Only one of these was actually built, and it was a twin-engine prototype bomber, which was designed in the 30s, built in the 40s, and retired in the 40s. Its first flight was on the 24th of April 1940, and basically it was piloted by Reserve Lieutenant Dura E. Dakovic, a transport pilot who was part of Aeroput, and the initial testing justified all expectations of the vehicle, so therefore it went pretty well. But unfortunately, on the third test flight, the pilot was unable to lower the landing gear, so this meant they had to go in belly down, and this damaged the propellers and also the engines of the vehicle. Because they relied on getting some parts for replacement for the propellers and also landing gear from Germany and France, and since it was 1940 at the time, let's just say the repairs were delayed quite a lot. The aircraft was eventually rebuilt so that testing could be resumed at the end of March 41, but in early April, the bombing of Zemun airport damaged the prototype again, and in late June 1941, the Germans scrapped the aircraft after the invasion. The vehicle itself, powered by 2 Hispano-Suiza 14AB Bs, which gave it 740 horsepower each, and with a pretty nice armament on it and also a pretty decent bomb load, this thing could be pretty good. But at the same time, only one of them was ever built. It also has a very unique nose design. I would definitely say go and have a look at it. The next one is the Zmaj Fury. This is just like the Ikarus Fury, as we talked about before, but it was fitted with a 745 horsepower engine. This meant that this was the fastest Fury biplane along with its Ikarus brother. It was also armed with 4 7.7mm machine guns instead of the 2 that you would find on the British version. And then the last vehicle is the Zmaj DO-17KB2 or KB3. And these are just DO-17s, you know, the ones that we have in game already, but they were re-engined. They had access to the KB2 had access to French engines, and the latter, the KB3, had access to Italian ones, making them slightly different. So that is the second part of the Yugoslavian stuff done. We still have a lot to cover when it comes to this Yugoslav stuff. You know, we have Soko, Udva, and also Rogasarski. And Udva and Soko have a ton of really interesting stuff, so it'll be really nice to go over them. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Teddy, John Ryman, Universe, Conte Baraka, Trigger Hippie, Eugens Terry, Ambrosius McClellan, Daniel Stanton, Martinez, B. Young, Hosest Kishore, Hans, Bareen, and Samuel Schlick for supporting the channel.